Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my updated Game Week 1 draft. This is going to be the third update of my draft in Game Week 1. Very close now towards the start of the FPL season. We have around 10 days left before the start of the season. I'm also planning to bring in a very special guest that we saw last season to also show his debut draft on Sunday. So hopefully we get to see a sort of very famous player's draft very quickly. Someone who's actually probably going to be a recurring player on the channel who I've been very lucky to befriend. But we'll save that as a bit of a sneak preview. As far as the draft in terms of changes, I think, what's changed in the FPL landscape. I think within Spurs, you have the Maddison injury, and there's going to be some compound impacts there. Within Aston Villa's space, I think it seems like actually they're going to be in the market for another attacking player, which I was actually quite shocked that they haven't already signed a player, but they seem quite close to Gessan from Liga. He played for Nice last season, someone who actually played a mixture of almost second striker, left wing, right wing primarily, but is someone who has filled in the center forward position as well, especially since Laborde, that sort of dominant striker within that team, didn't play all the minutes within that season. So actually Gassan played a lot of minutes in different positions, and I kind of feel like he's going to be in a very similar mold towards someone like Rashford, where he plays largely winger minutes but could also fill in the center forward position. So to me, that has a small compound impact on Watkins, but I think the largest impact is I no longer have interest in Malin within my draft. I made a video just yesterday on the best budget mids. Malin, unfortunately, I think is probably going to be taken out of that list because of the sort of impacts of a potential transfer like that. But if it happens, right? And it hasn't happened yet. What I have done, though, is I've taken some of the learnings from that sort of video and creating that video and incorporated that into my draft as well. And as I said, there's other things that we need to take into account. Right now, when I look at this draft, I've just kind of rated it by the Fantasy Football Hub team AI rating, and it actually is rated a 90 out of 100. As I've mentioned, I think part of this is because of things like I don't have too much Arsenal within my draft, which I know that the AI really, really loves. And no surprise, because I think it's kind of imputing a lot more Arsenal strength this season from the attacking point of view. But I'm still sort of backing Palmer generally as a consensus. What's also interesting from the Fantasy Football Hub AI, which you can find literally in the link in the description below and get your own team rated, is I think it has a lot of love for some of the other, let's say, defenders that I don't have in my team, like maybe some of the 6.0 type defenders, and they're going to be expected to be extremely strong. But without further ado, let's have a look at my own draft. I've stuck with the structure of Sanchez plus a 4.0 goalkeeper all drafting season long since my first draft. I feel really comfortable that Sanchez is the best goalkeeper. That's a little bit of a middle point between spending the full 5.5 million on a Raya with mediocre fixtures and actually sort of investing into Chelsea continuing their really good defensive form. And so that's why I'm on Sanchez. The 4.0 goalkeeper is most likely going to be Dubravka, but for the time being, it's going to be Valdemarson. Not that it really matters. If Dubravka moves, or if we, let's say, get a chance of maybe even, maybe let's say someone like a Perry not being able to start in Game Week 1, I'll probably own a Darlow, for example, from Leeds. As far as, let's say, my defense, though, I've made a few changes. So I've actually knocked off the Nottingham Forest defenders, and I still feel a little bit weird about that, in the sense that I still think they're amazing. I still think that at the 5.0 price point, you've got great options. At the 5.5 price point, you've got great options. So I feel like the pick that I've gone with here in defense that has sort of moved away from Nico Williams is Colwill. And part of it is this sort of investment into doubling down on the Chelsea defense and feeling like Chelsea's an extremely strong team. Is it going to maybe close me off from triple Chelsea early on if I really feel like I want to pivot into another player? Potentially, yes. And I think that's a concern for the draft, which is why I'm still a little bit shaky on this position. It could very well just be Nico Williams. But I have kept Tarkowski in the team, as opposed to, let's say, going for someone like Murillo. And I've also dropped Munoz. And a lot of people will probably sort of identify, why bring Pedro Porro into the team? Part of it, I think, is because Pedro Porro actually has really good rotation with Estev. And I am sort of pricing in a transfer here. When I look at Pedro Porro, I think the opening fixtures are really good. When I compare it to, let's say, Crystal Palace's opening fixtures, there's the Aston Villa away game that really sticks out, and even more so the Chelsea away game. So I'm kind of eyeing up a transfer here for this draft, and I think the logic behind this defense is very much going to be Pedro Porro to Munoz as a Game Week 4 move, on the basis that the rest of my team is going to be close to perfect, right? Why have I picked certain players here that I think are going to stay in the draft? Because I feel quite comfortable in, Tarkowski, in Colwill, and Anderson, and Estev keeping their positions in the team. With Pedro Porro, we know that Udogie is likely to be out for the start of the season. So I think his minutes are absolutely nailed, particularly for the game weeks that I really want him to be in my team for. So it's most likely going to be Jed Spence left back, Pedro Porro right back. And then I'm going to just simply move into Munoz as soon as I possibly can in game week 4 when he's got Sunderland. So that's really the logic behind going for Pedro Porro. I am pricing in a defender transfer, which I'm sure a lot of people might dislike, but I think it gives me a lot of upside to start with, and then I can still pivot to one of the best options in the game, who I'm very happy to own from that point on. And that's going to be the reason for Pedro Porro. Anderson is, as I mentioned within some of my previous videos, he kind of covers what I previously mentioned was the value of, let's say, a defender who can cover the poor game week 5 for, let's say, Everton, and some other poor game weeks for some other teams, right? So Anderson is probably the best 4.5 defender in the game. That's my opinion. I'm happy to be wrong. But when we look at Fulham last season, the reason why they're so strong and why we still rate them a lot, or why models rate them a lot, is because their defensive numbers, the underlying stats that is, were really good. Were the clean sheets good? No. But I think, as I said, and I have the confidence in saying from playing multiple seasons now, I think generally speaking, the trends in terms of the expected numbers for defense are much more consistent in terms of forecasting future predicted clean sheets compared to something like what last season's clean sheets are. What's a good example of that? When City were entirely dominant as a team, they weren't always actually consistently topping the league with clean sheets, but on average they were. And the stat that they were really honing in on was the sort of expected goals conceded, where they were leading the league for the most point up until in recent years. They've clearly taken a nosedive, and teams like Arsenal have stepped up massively, whereas even Liverpool last season jumped in and I think definitely pipped City as, you know, the third best defense in the league. And obviously City ended the season probably as a middle table defense, to be honest, but we expect City to kind of improve a little bit even on the defensive side of things. Hence why we set expectations that are not just narrowed down to or focused on what last season's production were. So I tend to think, yeah, Forest is a team that probably will slip a little bit this season, and that's okay. We have Aina as well, who's not even, for example, part of the preseason for Forest. So I think you can argue that the quality of the defense is a little bit worse than it is come game week 1. And with Colwill and Sanchez, I just feel really confident that Chelsea ended the season very well as a defense. They were very impressive in the Club World Cup, as I mentioned, always, with the exception to that Flamengo game, which also created a lot of great memes on the internet that I won't mention here, that I probably can't mention here. And then Estev, actually, the reason why I moved into a 4.0 is simply because something that I was thinking about previously was, okay, I thought I really needed multiple 4.5 defenders in my team that were really strong, especially if I'm going to field a little bit of a lighter team. But what I've kind of noticed is that, especially with the defensive con aspect of the game, as long as you almost have rotation between your 3 out of 4 players, and then the 5th defender is a 4.0 who actually will very consistently play for that team. Let's say, who are the 4.0 options that we're talking about? We're talking about Goodmanson from Leeds. We're talking about maybe Ronan from Leeds as well, Reynaldo from Sunderland, and then Estev from Burnley. Now, Estev actually has some of the best CBIT numbers out of all the defenders that I've just mentioned, which is why I feel like quite confident that he's going to do well. We also know that Burnley last season in the Championship were one of the better defensive teams, actually second best to Leeds in terms of expected numbers, but of course they really, really overperformed in terms of the amount of clean sheets they were able to secure, creating a record, in fact. And so when I think about it now, it's more so the case that the 4.0 defender has never, ever been stronger in FPL because of DEFCON, right? So if you're a really poor team, you're still allowing yourself very consistently an opportunity to get +2 points, even though you might also concede points. Whereas in the past, the 4.0 defender really had no value as a rotation piece, or even as, you know, your second bench option, for example. And what do I mean by that? In the past, this is the type of player who might actually get you negative points. This is the type of player who might have gotten you 0 points on a singular game week. Whereas now the expectation, I think, is very much kind of offset by the opportunity for a center back from some of these teams to actually simply get you a very solid baseline within certain matches. And so that's kind of why I feel like the average expectation for a 4.0 defender is more so around that sort of 2.5 to maybe 2.8 type range, as opposed to in the past where these are players who you generally expect to average between 0 to 1 points. So I feel like that's a massive fundamental shift in terms of how we kind of evaluate these defenders, and why I feel a little bit more comfortable now going for 4.0s. I know I've mentioned in previous videos that I don't really like 4.0s, and I still don't love it, but I think just actually seeing the projections for some of these 4.0 defenders, especially when we look at some models, like what's a good example of being able to have an assessment of this? When I go, for example, in fantasy football, when I go on the prediction tool, I can actually quickly look at all the 4.0 defenders over 8 game weeks and actually have a look at, you know, what are the expectations for them. And interestingly, when you look at players like Estev, he's top of the list in the 4.0s. Not saying that he's an amazing pick, but if you look at game week 2, for example, with this game versus Sunderland, he's expected to have 4.3 points per game. I don't think you would ever have seen that in the past. And then the nice thing is that even against tough opposition like Tottenham, like United, like Liverpool, he's still expected to actually get somewhere like 2.8 to 2.9 points per game because of this new change with DEFCON. And I think that's awesome, right? The fact that we can actually use some models and predictions to actually help support creating the draft structure that we have. So that's why I think it's so interesting to actually now include the 4.0s. I must say, you know, I've probably made a mistake in terms of underestimating how valuable the 4.0s are compared to in previous seasons where I think they were inherently awful. So that's kind of my hot take there. And, you know, I'm okay to change my mind. The whole point of new changes is embracing them and trying to understand how best to make use of them, which is why I've landed on this draft structure. As I said, Colwill is the only defender here where I feel a little bit shaky about him from game week 1, where is this a weak triple up for Chelsea? Potentially, but am I good at triple up for Chelsea? I'm not so sure. I do really like Colwill. I think he's comparable to Nico Williams. I just think that the Nottingham Forest team is probably going to start the season off a little bit weaker, especially without Aina being there. And that kind of makes me want to go towards Colwill because we're also starting to see that this Nottingham Forest team is trying a lot of new sort of lineups and tactics. I kind of feel like I trust Chelsea, I suppose, based on the form that they kind of posted near the end and the Club World Cup. So here I am with Colwill and Sanchez. In the midfield now, I've made a couple changes, right? And the changes are I've suddenly moved Elliot Anderson, the Messiah, the 5.5 guy who's in a lot of people's drafts, out of my team. And part of this is because I think the value towards, let's say, some of the drafts that I've gone with recently is that if you go for a 3-5-2 and you kind of ignore the third forward and you're kind of ignoring bench boost, I think it's totally okay to spend as much money on the forward line as possible. So instead of spending the 6.0s in the defense, I'm kind of clawing back that 0.5 and allowing myself to spend that across the board. So what I've chosen to do in this instance is I've decided to spend a lot more money in the midfield. So I brought Bruno into this. I've brought Mitoma into this as well. Part of this also is because I've had Rodgers in a lot of my drafts, and looking into the DEFCON numbers once again, as unfortunate as it is, right, and how that drives our logic, players like Ndiaye definitely did have an impact last season with the sort of DEFCON points. Mitoma did as well, even though he's the worst Brighton midfielder for DEFCON points, as I did an analysis over within sort of my budget midfielder video. But as I mentioned also with the season long tallies for the sort of cheap mids, Mitoma is probably the safest pick absolutely as of right now in terms of actually being able to secure you at that sort of projected goal margin over a pretty okay run of fixtures, with exception to game week 6 being that Chelsea away fixture. So that's why I have Mitoma now in my draft over an Elliot Anderson. One of my other concerns is I've also sort of looked into the news. Nottingham Forest seem to be bringing in some more midfielders, so more depth and more European football probably means that Elliot Anderson's minutes are slightly worse, right? One thing about new transfer signings is they're obviously going to impact other players who are not so significant. So what am I thinking about here? In the Nottingham Forest team, a midfield signing is most likely going to replace the minutes that Ibrahim Sangare played, right? And it might impact, for example, the minutes of Dominguez, as opposed to, let's say, Elliot Anderson, who's actually quite a crucial player of the team alongside someone like Gibbs White. These are the types of players who actually play the most amount of minutes for this Nottingham Forest side, and I can't see that changing necessarily. But it's just about talking about the knock-on impact and expecting a little bit rotation, because I think one thing that is a trend that we can generally see from someone like, let's say, Nuno, is that he is happy to rotate his players. Elliot Anderson, I think, was 7th in terms of the most amount of minutes played last season, and I can expect as a growing player, as a 21-year-old, now moving on to 22, he's going to play more minutes, right? So that's a pro, but I think part of the reason why I'm just simply moving to Mitoma here is, do I think he's flat out better than Elliot Anderson? Yes. So that's kind of why I've moved into Mitoma here. And as I said, he has the sort of most guaranteed open play goal threat, as long as I think he's going to start the season fit, right? Last season, he ended the season with this sort of injury that he was dealing with a minutes restriction. I'm expecting him to start the season out fine. In the previous friendly, we actually saw Mitoma play 90 minutes. I'm hoping to see more consistent minutes in the preseason for Mitoma, and for him to just start the season off with really good minutes and no injuries, and hopefully I can enjoy his performances from there. With Ndiaye, I feel like he's the pick where we now understand, with a lot of people sort of kind of analysis over the sort of 6.5 million category, but also specifically looking at the kind of open play attackers and looking at their sort of numbers projected, how strong someone like Ndiaye can be. And so that's why I feel super comfortable actually having Ndiaye in my team at this moment in time. I just think the C-bits are there, the penalties are there, the minutes are most likely going to be slightly improved compared to last season when he was coming back from that meniscus injury. So that's why I have these two players in my draft, Ndiaye and Mitoma. I feel like they're a solid mix of everything. Mitoma doesn't offer you things like, for example, penalties, or let's say maybe even too many set pieces, right? But I think the pro of Mitoma is definitely just the minutes that I'm expecting him to start with the season. An improvement from Brighton, because they're actually just a team that have consistently posted really good underlying stats, and his underlying stats as well for a 6.5 sort of bracket of player are very, very good, right? His underlying stats are actually better than someone like, let's say, Rodgers when you compare to last season and you look at things like NPXG, which is why I feel a little bit more confident now moving someone like Rodgers away from my sort of latest draft. And he's going to be a big miss, but I feel like one of the things with Rodgers is that he's just a very consistent, slow taking option. I feel like if I do miss the boat on Rodgers, that is unfortunate, but am I comfortable going with Mitoma instead and probably saving an additional 0.5? Generally, yes. So that's kind of why I have Mitoma. And another reason why I have Mitoma is something that I'm going to jump into at the end of the video, because it's actually a part of my chip strategy logic, which I think is worth talking about as well. But yeah, I've gone for Mitoma and Ndiaye, and then Palmer and Salah are just locks. I don't need to talk about these two players. The reason why I brought in Bruno, right? And Bruno sort of replaces Rodgers in my draft as well. Part of this is because in the forward position, I just am really struggling to actually pick a player that I really like. I think that the most expensive non-Watkins striker that I like right now, assuming that Solanke's not going to be really fit to start the season with good minutes, is going to be Bowen, right? Bowen at 8.0. So I think Bowen's actually a fantastic pick, and I still think there's an opportunity for me to go there. But looking into Bruno's CBIT numbers, looking into what we expect to be as the improvement of United this season, I feel really confident in Bruno just being a solid pick and someone who I feel like in a very similar mold to Rodgers is just going to be a slow burner that I feel confident in starting. And because he has access to so many things and avenues to getting points, because I've watched him in the preseason and he's looked good regardless of whether he plays center mid, regardless of whether he plays in the left 10 position. He's kept all the set pieces in the preseason as well. One thing that I was slightly worried about was, is Mbeumo and Cunha going to take more set pieces from Bruno? That hasn't really been the case. I feel like penalties as well he's going to take. He took a penalty in the preseason as well in the game versus Everton. So, yeah, I just feel like Bruno's an extremely solid all-round pick. He does give you the DEFCON points as well, which a recurring theme in this draft is everyone except for Mitoma really does provide DEFCONs on top of sort of the open play value or even the intangibles like set pieces, like penalties, etc. So that's going to be my midfield draft. It's changed a little bit. Do I still feel okay maybe if I wanted to move back into a Rodgers plus a Bowen? I think I'm totally fine with that, right? The reason why I'm currently on this draft as it stands is simply because I have faith that Igor Thiago can start the season, which is a perfect segue into my forward position. I've gone with Watkins, Krupi Jr. at this time, and then Thiago. Now, if let's say Gu is expected to go to Sunderland, I think Krupi Jr. becomes Gu, right? There's no need to discuss around that 4.5 position. But as it stands, I think the two options in terms of my draft is I either go Bruno plus Thiago if I know that Wisa is not going to start the season for Brentford, and he's, for example, he continuously, I guess, misses out in training, misses out in preseason for Brentford, and maybe Brentford just choose to maybe look for the fastest way to sell him and kind of get rid of him. Then, of course, I think Thiago makes a lot of sense as a pick because you're almost taking in someone who we expect to play a lot of minutes for this Brentford team, someone who we expect to sort of deputize in terms of penalties, and someone who will benefit alongside Bruno, who will be that slow ticker. As far as a Watkins, I still feel like at this moment in time, Watkins is a really safe pick to start with. Is he a 9.0 pick that we can pivot into other positions? Easily, right? Because if Watkins isn't a pick that we love at the start, and you, let's say, play out some of the nice opening fixtures, and maybe by, let's say, the Sunderland game in Game Week 5, you don't really want to own Watkins anymore. As we've mentioned many times on this channel, there's always going to be the opportunity to pivot into someone like Gyökeres, right? And if it isn't, then you just get to keep Watkins perpetually, who hopefully still has really good minutes to start the season, and pretty much has good fixtures up until Game Week 8. So that's kind of the plan with Watkins. With Igor Thiago, I think he's just going to be at 6.0. I feel like he has more value than some of the midfielders that we've mentioned. Like I've done some videos on Tielemans, on Paqueta. These are players who are very good as well, right? Paqueta could be on penalties as well. He could have really good minutes. He's good at DEFCON. Tielemans as well. If he's on penalties, he becomes a monster as well. But I don't think Thiago is too far away from those picks. And so I feel quite confident going with Bruno and Thiago here. But as I've mentioned, I'm very comfortable as well going for something like a Rodgers plus Watkins that is basically the same amount of money. And I feel like it's kind of interchangeable. It just really depends on what I want to go with. I feel quite confident that Thiago is probably going to start the season at this moment in time. So I'm on a Thiago plus Bruno draft. But can it be easily an option too, which is going to be this sort of Bowen plus Rodgers draft? Absolutely, it can. But that's going to be the draft as it stands. Now, the point that I'm going to go back to which was basically on chip strategy, was what is the sort of theme of this draft? I think the theme of this draft is that it doesn't need to work with with a very specific free hit strategy, but I'm going to mention a very specific free hit window that I think that this draft can still kind of coalesce with. What is that going to be? Free hit 6. Free hit 6 is Man City, versus Burnley, being one of the key fixtures. So that's an opportunity for us to, let's say, watch the first 5 games of Pep Guardiola's Man City. See what the minutes are for Marmoush. Is he going to continuously start every single match with the sort of new fully loaded depth that they have? Yes or no? Who's the defender that's actually consistently starting? Is Ait Nouri absolutely nailed for this Man City team? Yes or no? And so you have the option, I think, in free hit 6 to actually pivot into the best captaincy of the week, right? Which is suddenly moving away from a poor Salah game on paper, which is Everton at home, which is obviously still a great game. And a lot of people are going to say, why would you move away from Salah versus Everton? I'd probably still prefer, maybe let's say Palmer versus United. I'm sure a lot of people take disagreement with that. But I think if you're going for a Haaland draft on a free hit, you're probably not going to be able to afford Salah if you want to have all the kind of other cream of the crop options. It's a really good game week to move into a lot of players, right? So who am I thinking about now? I think for Bruno, it's a good game week because you've got Brentford away, which is a solid match. For all the Nottingham Forest options that I've missed out on within my draft, that's a really good game to bring them back into the team. I can triple up on Nottingham Forest as well. So that for me is kind of one of the pros in terms of game week 6. You can go for Wood, you can go for Gibbs White, you can go for another defender as well. It's still a really good game week for NDIA, for example, which I like. It's also a week that, let's say, where Spurs have a really good fixture as well. So if we, let's say, missed out on Solanke in game week 1, it's another opportunity to revisit someone like Solanke as well. So that's what I really like about that sort of free hit core structure of the draft, right? I'm not going to have City players in my draft in game week 1 as of the time of recording this video, but by free hit 6, I will have 3 City players, right? So that's a good capitalization of the Burnley match. I'll probably have Palmer over Salah just for fun reasons. I'll have triple Nottingham Forest, and then I can have the rest of my team either being, for example, Tottenham players or any other players that I can actually fit into my team that are reasonable, right? Because when you look at game week 6, what are the other fixtures that stand out? I would say even maybe being able to target another potential Chelsea player could make sense, but is not necessary. Well, I'm going to definitely ignore Newcastle and Arsenal, but it's a good opportunity, as I said, to invest into Spurs, to invest into Nottingham Forest as well. And that's probably going to be the core of the draft, right? Crystal Palace versus Liverpool is also going to be generally a tough game for me owning Crystal Palace players, me owning Liverpool players. So that's kind of why I feel like free hit 6 is really nice. If I go for this sort of Munoz transfer, I ignore one of Crystal Palace's worst games, and that's it. I come back to a really strong team going forwards with this core draft structure, with Porro to Munoz being the one book transfer that I have. And that's kind of the logic that I have in terms of chip strategy for the start of the season. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the sort of team selection here. Another thing to point out too in terms of chip strategy is now the Fantasy Football Hub tool actually have a chip strategy loaded as part of the My Team tool. So if you actually wanted to use the pro tools, you can find the link in the description below, have a look at Fantasy Football Hub, and then sort of incorporate your bench boost strategy. If you want to put the bench boost in there, I'm not looking at bench boost myself, but if you want to put bench boost in there, or maybe even a free hit strategy, the AI algorithm can kind of help support you with whatever transfers and plans that you specifically have that are very niche and can kind of help you optimize around those game weeks. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.